It was a quiet afternoon when everything began to change. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the neighborhood as I made my way to the garage. I had been helping Mrs. Jenkins, my 64-year-old neighbor, with a few tasks around the house for the past few months. Ever since her husband had started traveling more for work, she'd been needing an extra pair of hands. It felt harmless at first, just helping with the lawn, fixing small things around the house. Nothing out of the ordinary. But lately something had shifted. It was in the way she looked at me, the way her hand would linger a little too long when she passed me a glass of lemonade, the way her eyes seemed to follow me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. After all, she was my neighbor, much older than me and married. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. This afternoon it was different. Her husband was out of town again, and she had asked me to come over to help move some boxes in the garage. Nothing unusual, I thought. Just a simple favor. But when I walked into the garage, I felt that familiar tension again, the one I had been trying to ignore for weeks. She was standing by the workbench, sorting through a pile of old tools, her posture relaxed, but her eyes watchful as I approached. Her silver hair was pinned up neatly, and she wore a simple blouse and jeans, looking casual but effortlessly put together as always. "Thanks for coming by," she said with a soft smile, her voice warm and familiar. "These boxes are heavier than I expected, and I figured you'd be the best person to help." I nodded, returning her smile. "Of course, Mrs. Jenkins. It's no trouble at all." Her eyes flickered for a moment, something unreadable passing across her face. "You can call me Evelyn, you know. We've known each other long enough." I hesitated, the sound of her name on my tongue feeling strange, but I nodded. "All right, Evelyn." There was a brief pause, the silence between us filled with the quiet hum of the neighborhood outside. She glanced down at the boxes, then back at me, her smile faltering slightly. "I really appreciate you helping me with all of this," she said softly, stepping closer. "I know I've been asking a lot of you lately." I waved it off, feeling a sudden rush of heat in my chest. "It's no problem. I'm happy to help." She nodded, her eyes lingering on mine for a beat too long. And then, before I could move to start on the boxes, she reached out, her hand lightly brushing against my arm. The touch was soft, almost casual, but it sent a jolt through me, and I tensed, my pulse quickening in a way that made me instantly uncomfortable. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice quiet, her hand still resting on my arm. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little tired." Her eyes stayed on mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something there, something that mirrored the confusion and tension I'd been feeling. But she pulled her hand back, giving me space. "Well, let's not make this harder than it needs to be," she said, her voice light again as she gestured to the boxes. I moved toward them, grateful for the distraction, but I could still feel the lingering warmth of her touch on my skin. As I lifted the first box, I couldn't shake the strange tension that hung in the air between us, the feeling that something unspoken was passing between us, waiting to be acknowledged. As I moved the boxes, I could feel Evelyn's eyes on me. She hovered nearby, watching with an intensity that made me nervous. Every time I turned, her gaze would meet mine, and she'd smile, soft, almost apologetic, as if she knew the effect she was having but wasn't quite ready to acknowledge it. The work itself wasn't difficult, just a bit tedious. I made small talk to keep things light, asking her about her husband's latest trip and how she was handling the quiet. She responded politely, but there was a distance in her answers, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. After what felt like hours, I finally lifted the last box onto the shelf and stepped back, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "That's it," I said, forcing a grin. "You're all set." Evelyn smiled back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She stepped closer again, and for a moment I thought she might reach out and touch me like before. But she didn't. Instead, she just stood there, looking at me with a strange, searching expression. I really don't know what I'd do without you around, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I shrugged, trying to play it off. It's nothing. Happy to help. Her eyes flickered again, and this time the silence between us felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite place. She took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling in a way that drew my attention more than it should have. I quickly averted my eyes, feeling a rush of guilt. I've been thinking, she began, her voice hesitant, about how much time we've been spending together lately. I nodded, unsure where she was going with this. It's nice, she continued, stepping closer still. I didn't realize how lonely it would be with him gone so much. Her words hung in the air, and I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way my heart had started to race. This was crossing a line. I could feel it. But I didn't move, didn't pull away. I just stood there, frozen in place as she took another step closer, until there was barely any space between us. Evelyn, I began, my voice shaky. She cut me off, her hand reaching out again, this time resting lightly on my chest. The touch was gentle, but it sent a shockwave through me. My breath hitched, and for a brief moment I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I could feel her warmth, the softness of her fingers pressing against me, and suddenly, everything else fell away. I've been lonely, she whispered, her eyes searching mine. More than I realized. I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but nothing came. All I could think about was how close she was, how the faint scent of her perfume filled the air between us, how her hand was still resting on my chest, and how much I wanted to close the gap between us. This is, I started, but the words felt hollow, like I didn't really believe them. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes, the way her body was angled toward mine, it said everything. And in that moment, I knew that if I didn't walk away right now, if I didn't put a stop to this, I would cross a line that couldn't be undone. But I didn't move. Instead, I reached up, hesitating for only a second before placing my hand on top of hers. Her breath hitched, and I could feel the rapid beat of her pulse under my fingertips. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every rational thought I had left was screaming at me to stop. But I didn't. Evelyn, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Her name tasted strange on my tongue, intimate in a way I hadn't expected. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with something I didn't want to acknowledge, something I had been trying to ignore for weeks. Slowly I leaned in, my lips hovering just inches from hers, waiting for her to pull away, to tell me to stop. But she didn't. She just stood there, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts, her eyes locked on mine. And then, without another word, she closed the gap. Her lips were soft, warm, and the moment they touched mine, something inside me snapped. I kissed her back, my hands moving to her waist, pulling her closer, as all the tension that had been building between us for weeks finally exploded. It was slow at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters. But then, as if a switch had been flipped, the kiss deepened, the restraint we had been holding onto disappearing in an instant. I could feel her hands slide up to my shoulders, her fingers tangling in my shirt as she pressed herself against me, and I couldn't help the low groan that escaped my throat. This was wrong, so wrong, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not her husband, not the consequences, nothing. It was just her, just us, caught in something we couldn't control. We stumbled backward, our bodies tangled together as we moved toward the workbench. I felt the cold edge of it press against my back, but I barely registered it. All I could focus on was the way her lips moved against mine, the warmth of her body, the way her hands gripped me like she never wanted to let go. For a long time, we stayed like that, lost in the heat of the moment, our kisses growing more urgent, more desperate. The rational part of my brain was still screaming at me to stop, to push her away, to end this before it went too far. But the pull between us was too strong, too intoxicating to resist. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our bodies still pressed close, our lips just inches apart. Evelyn's eyes were wide, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she stared up at me. There was a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. This can't happen again," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, though the words felt empty. We both knew it wasn't that simple. We had already crossed a line, and no matter how much we told ourselves it wouldn't happen again, the truth was, we both wanted it to. "I know," I said, my voice hoarse. But even as I said the words, I leaned in again, brushing my lips softly against hers, testing the waters one last time. She didn't pull away. Her breath hitched as our lips brushed again, the connection between us rekindling instantly. It wasn't a soft kiss this time, not tentative or hesitant like the first. It was needier, fueled by everything we had been denying for too long. Her hands moved up my chest, gripping the fabric of my shirt, pulling me closer, as if she was afraid that letting go might snap the delicate thread holding us together. I kissed her harder, my hands slipping around her waist, pulling her body firmly against mine. The cool air of the garage seemed to vanish, replaced by the heat that radiated between us. I could feel her heart pounding beneath my touch, matching the rapid beat of my own. The world outside, the cars, the distant chatter of neighbours, her absent husband, faded into the background, leaving only us, locked in this dangerous moment. "This isn't right," she whispered against my lips, even as her hands tightened around my shoulders, refusing to let go. "I know," I murmured, but I couldn't stop. Neither could she. I leaned back slightly, my forehead resting against hers as we both struggled to catch our breath. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted, and I could see the conflict written all over her face. I should have pulled away then, given her the space to come to her senses, but instead, I found myself lifting her hand to my lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. The simple touch made her shiver. "I can't," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. But her body betrayed her. She didn't move. She didn't step back. She stayed, her eyes slowly fluttering open to meet mine. Her gaze was full of unspoken emotions, desire, guilt, confusion, all swirling together in a way that mirrored exactly what I was feeling. I knew we were on the verge of something irreversible, something that couldn't be undone once we crossed that final line. But standing there, so close to her, I realized that part of me didn't care anymore. "We need to stop this," I whispered, my hands still resting on her waist, my voice betraying the weakness I felt. But instead of pulling away, Evelyn reached up, her fingers tracing the side of my face with a tenderness that made my heart ache. There was something so intimate about the way she touched me, like she was memorizing the shape of my jaw, the curve of my lips, every small detail she had been trying to ignore for weeks. "I don't know how," she admitted softly. Neither did I. We stood there, caught in that suspended moment, both of us teetering on the edge of a decision we couldn't take back. And then slowly I leaned down, capturing her lips in another kiss, this one softer, more deliberate, as if I was trying to savor every second before it all fell apart. She kissed me back, her body relaxing into mine, her arms wrapping around my neck as she pressed herself closer. The slow burn of our mutual attraction had finally reached its peak, and I knew, without a doubt, that we had already crossed the line we had been skirting for so long. The next few moments were a blur of sensation. I could feel her hands slipping under my shirt, the warmth of her fingers against my skin sending shivers down my spine. My own hands were everywhere, her back, her hips, her neck, desperate to touch every part of her, to feel her pressed against me, to drown in the heat of her presence. We stumbled toward the workbench again, this time more frantic, more urgent. My mind was racing, caught between the overwhelming desire for her and the nagging voice in the back of my head telling me this was wrong, that we were making a mistake. But that voice was drowned out by the sound of her breath, her soft gasps against my neck as I kissed her again, harder this time, more desperate. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer as she whispered my name, a sound that sent a jolt of electricity through me, making it impossible to think clearly. I lifted her onto the workbench, my hands sliding up her thighs as she wrapped her legs around me, pulling me in even closer. The tension between us, the weeks of unresolved feelings, all came rushing to the surface, and I felt like I was drowning in it, unable to find a way out. "This is crazy," she breathed, her voice shaky, but she didn't stop. Neither did I. I kissed her again, silencing any lingering doubts. My hands moved over her body with a familiarity that shouldn't have been there, but somehow felt like it had always been. She responded to every touch, every kiss, as if she had been waiting for this moment just as long as I had. We were lost in each other, the world outside ceasing to exist as we gave in to the pull that had been drawing us together from the start. Time seemed to blur, the minutes slipping away as we crossed every boundary we had set for ourselves, our bodies moving together in a way that felt both inevitable and dangerous. By the time we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our skins slick with sweat, our hearts racing. Evelyn's chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands still gripping my shoulders as if she was afraid to let go. Her hair was a mess, her clothes dishevelled, but she looked beautiful, more beautiful than I had ever allowed myself to admit. I stepped back, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The reality of it all hit me like a freight train. We had done it. We had crossed the line. Evelyn slid off the workbench, her legs shaky as she adjusted her clothes, her eyes avoiding mine. I could see the guilt creeping in, the weight of what we had just done settling over her like a heavy blanket. I felt it too. The crushing realization that this wasn't just some harmless flirtation anymore. This was real, and it couldn't be undone. "We can't ever let this happen again," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded, though the words felt meaningless. We both knew it wasn't that simple. The connection between us was too strong, too undeniable to just walk away from. But neither of us wanted to admit it. Not now. Not when the guilt was so fresh, so raw. "I should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't stop her. I couldn't. I watched as she gathered her things, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was trying to process everything. The air between us was thick with tension, the weight of what we had done hanging over us like a cloud that refused to dissipate. As she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the handle for just a moment. She didn't turn to look at me, but I could hear the conflict in her voice when she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said softly, before slipping out of the garage and disappearing into the night. I stood there, staring at the door long after she had gone, the echo of her words ringing in my ears. The silence that followed was deafening, and I was left alone with the crushing weight of my actions, the reality of what had just happened settling over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I wanted to believe that we could move past this, that we could pretend like nothing had happened and go back to the way things were. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were agonizing. Every time I saw Evelyn, every time our eyes met across the street or in passing, the memory of that night came rushing back, vivid and undeniable. We didn't speak about it. We didn't even acknowledge it. But the tension was there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to explode again. I avoided her as much as I could, throwing myself into work, into anything that would keep my mind off her. But it didn't matter. The memory of her, the feel of her skin against mine, the sound of her breathless gasps. It was all still there, haunting me, pulling me back into that dangerous place. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if we would ever cross that line again, or if we would spend the rest of our lives pretending like it never happened. But one thing was certain. The connection between us wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. It was real. It was raw. and it was dangerous. As I stood there in the garage, staring at the spot where she had been, I realized that I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't control. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead was full of impossible choices. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't ready to let her go.